The Origins of Slavery in America, a Historical Examination. The history of slavery in America is a dark and complex chapter in the nation's past, rooted in centuries of exploitation, violence, and injustice. The institution of slavery has deep roots that stretch back to the earliest days of European colonization, and its legacy continues to reverberate through American society today. In this comprehensive analysis, we will explore the origins of slavery in America, tracing its evolution from the early colonial period to the abolitionist movement of the 19th century. Native American slavery. Before the arrival of European settlers, indigenous peoples in North America practiced various forms of servitude and captivity, but these systems differed significantly from the chattel slavery that would later emerge under European colonization. Native American societies often engaged in practices such as captivity raids, where individuals from rival tribes were taken as prisoners of war and incorporated into their captors' communities. However, these captives were typically absorbed into the tribe and eventually integrated into society rather than being treated as property. Introduction of African slavery. The origins of chattel slavery in America can be traced back to the early 17th century, when the first African slaves were brought to the English colonies in Virginia in 1619. At the time, the Virginia Company, seeking to address labor shortages in its tobacco plantations, purchased a group of approximately 20 enslaved Africans from a Dutch ship that had intercepted them off the coast of present-day Angola. Initially, the status of these early African arrivals in the English colonies was ambiguous, with some being treated as indentured servants rather than lifelong slaves. However, as the demand for labor in the burgeoning plantation economies of the southern colonies grew, the institution of chattel slavery began to take root. Legalization of slavery. The legal framework for chattel slavery in America began to solidify in the late 17th and early 18th centuries as colonial legislatures passed laws codifying the enslavement of Africans and their descendants. These laws, known as slave codes, established the legal basis for the perpetual enslavement of Africans and placed severe restrictions on their freedom and mobility. For example, the Virginia Slave Code of 1705 explicitly defined slaves as property and denied them basic rights such as the ability to own property, marry freely, or move about without permission from their owners. Similar laws were enacted in other colonies, further entrenching the institution of slavery in American society. Expansion of slavery. The growth of slavery in America was closely tied to the expansion of plantation agriculture, particularly in the southern colonies where cash crops such as tobacco, rice, and later cotton were cultivated on a large scale. Enslaved Africans provided the cheap and abundant labor force that made these plantations economically viable, and the demand for slaves increased as the plantation economy expanded. By the 18th century, slavery had become entrenched in the social and economic fabric of the southern colonies, with enslaved Africans comprising a significant portion of the population in states such as Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia. The transatlantic slave trade, which saw millions of Africans forcibly transported to the Americas, further fueled the growth of slavery in America, as enslaved Africans were bought and sold like commodities to meet the demands of the plantation economy. Justifications for slavery. The institution of slavery in America was justified by a complex web of ideological, economic, and racial arguments. Proponents of slavery often cited biblical passages, such as the Curse of Ham, as evidence of the divine sanction for enslaving Africans. Others argued that Africans were inherently inferior to Europeans and therefore suited for servitude. Economically, slavery was seen as essential to the prosperity of the southern colonies, as enslaved labor provided the backbone of the plantation economy. The wealth generated by slave labor enriched plantation owners and helped fuel the growth of the American economy, particularly in the South. Resistance and rebellion. Despite the harsh conditions of slavery, enslaved Africans resisted their oppression in a variety of ways, from subtle acts of defiance to outright rebellion. Slave revolts, such as the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina in 1739 and Nat Turner's Rebellion in Virginia in 1831, were dramatic expressions of resistance against the institution of slavery, although they were often brutally suppressed by authorities. Other forms of resistance included running away from plantations, sabotaging crops and equipment, and engaging in acts of cultural preservation and solidarity. These acts of resistance, though often small in scale, were important expressions of agency and autonomy for enslaved Africans living under the oppressive regime of slavery. Abolitionist movement. The abolitionist movement, which emerged in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, sought to end the institution of slavery through legal, political, and moral means. Influenced by Enlightenment ideals of liberty, equality, and human rights, abolitionists argued passionately against the evils of slavery and called for its immediate abolition. Abolitionist leaders such as Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and William Lloyd Garrison became powerful voices for the cause, using their words and actions to expose the brutal realities of slavery and mobilize public opinion against it. The abolitionist movement gained momentum in the decades leading up to the Civil War, as tensions over the issue of slavery intensified and the nation moved closer to the brink of conflict. Civil War and Emancipation. The outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 marked a turning point in the history of slavery in America. As the conflict escalated, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, declaring that all slaves in Confederate-held territory were to be set free. While the Emancipation Proclamation did not immediately end slavery in the United States, it signaled a decisive shift in the federal government's policy towards the institution. The 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, ratified in 1865, formally abolished slavery throughout the country, bringing an end to centuries of legalized bondage. The passage of the 13th Amendment represented a profound victory for the abolitionist movement and a testament to the enduring struggle for freedom and equality in America.